You're listening to a Better Mousetrap podcast, a joint production by Marcos Dinnerstein and Far From TV. Our goal is to bring you, the listener, closer to the technology community here in New York City.
I'm Marcos Dinnerstein, host of a Better Mousetrap podcast. Today, we're speaking with Clayton Banks, co-founder of Silicon Harlem. We're at the Smart Cities New York conference, where members of city, state, and national government, along with NGOs and policy groups, have all convened to share and learn from one another. The conference will cover topics ranging from smart and sustainable buildings, using data to improve local economies, and much more. Let's hear from Clayton Banks how Silicon Harlem is part of this conversation.
And tell us what you've been doing here at Smart Cities.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be on your show, Marcos. And I hope your audience is enjoying the wonderful weather here in New York City. I'm here at Smart Cities, one, because we're at Silicon Harlem so involved in the infrastructure of our city to where we know that the future is going to require that a lot of things get tested, a lot of research to be done to figure out what's going to be scalable, sustainable, and, of course, commercialized. And we believe Silicon Harlem, being in the mix of all of that, is going to make sure that it's also inclusive and creates infrastructure for equity, making our city the best city in the world.
So what kind of panels have you been involved in here at Smart Cities New York?
Well, the first one that I've been involved with, which I think was really important, is how do you future-proof technology? You know, every moment there seems to be something new coming out, and it's very hard for most of our citizens to keep up with it all. And I'm young enough to remember how digital divides have been built over years, and a lot of it is just due to lack of information, and some of it's due to inability to afford a new technology. So one of the great things about this particular event, Smart Cities New York, and having us on a panel about future-proofing tech will allow us to sort of bridge that gap, help people actually leapfrog in technology and not trail behind. Actually, think about it this way. If you introduce a new piece of technology and you haven't considered the community, all you've done is created a gap. Whereas if you talk to the community and they tell you about a specific need and you design around that, you've created parity, you've created opportunity. And that first panel that I was on was very much focused on that. How do we make this fair and accessible and, at the end of the day, affordable?
And were there, in your view, practical solutions suggested during this panel?
There were, including our own. Silicon Harlem has its own way of bridging these gaps. One of them has to do with digital literacy. If we know that a digital divide is created by lack of knowledge or lack of funds, I feel I can at least try to address one of those, and that is education. So we very much focus on intergenerational digital literacy to make sure that at minimum the community knows about a technology. This event is a perfect example where I have predicted about 2 years ago that smart technology will be the next digital divide. And that's because some people won't know about it and some people won't be able to afford it. So like you, Marcos, and your followers, if I know something, I ought to try to preempt it. So the Smart Cities New York event that I'm here at and events that I'll have throughout the year is all about how do we preempt the next digital divide. We know it's going to come, so how do we preempt it to where we don't even feel it? Well, part of it is us going into schools, helping young people learn more and more about STEM and digital access, going into senior citizen homes, making it relevant to their lives, being able to provide space and opportunity for people to have the access in order to build their own digital literacy strategies and so forth. In other words, let's make sure people are educated about this next generation technology and take full advantage of it.
I love it. So it's not a technical solution per se. It's a human solution that will give people access to technical tools. Is that a fair characterization?
It is. I liken it to my childhood where I knew I had, a pretty good brain. I knew I was smart, but I also wondered why I would get the highest scores in my first, second, and third grade. And I realized my father bought me and my siblings a children's encyclopedia. So I had like this tremendous access to most of the information about the world. So when a teacher would talk about a particular person or area or country, I would dive into those encyclopedias like crazy, and I loved it. And my papers and things that I turned in reflected that. And I wondered why my friends didn't get the kind of scores I had, and I realized that a lot of my friends didn't have an encyclopedia. So it wasn't that I was so much smarter than anybody, it was the fact that I had access and exposure to something that they didn't. That's really the area that I want to see us focus on as a country, but specifically me in Silicon Harlem, is how do we get the most access and exposure to everyone so that it's more of a level playing field. The reality is that intelligence is distributed everywhere evenly, and by the way, since the beginning of time. So there's no real difference. It's just a matter of how you set up your systems that some people can get it and some people can't. It's not a lot of smart people in jail, so it's not a matter of intelligence. It's a matter of access and exposure.
Great, thank you. Now, changing gears, can you talk a little about the work that Silicon Harlem is doing with mesh networks? That's getting some nice talk in the city.
So there's 4 projects actually that we're working on. The one that you are alluding to is called RISE, which is really focused on building a resilient network in East Harlem. East Harlem sits in a floodplain, and when there's a storm like Hurricane Sandy superstorm, the East River tends to overflow. It then flows into the floodplain, which can damage and destroy, and has, businesses in East Harlem. So we decided to build a mesh resilient network that could actually survive a superstorm because it's not dependent on a backhaul. It has a backhaul, but if the backhaul gets destroyed by a storm, which often happens, our network is set up as a mesh to actually operate together like a WAN or a LAN, so that if you're in an emergency situation, you can still communicate with people in the neighborhood, in the community, to either get help or give help. So that is a near and dear project of ours because we're literally working in one of the toughest neighborhoods in New York, a Spanish-speaking first neighborhood in a lot of ways, but have the exact same needs and desires as any other neighborhood in New York City. So we are so proud to be a part of that. And one of the great things of the outcomes is we also focus on hiring young people out of the neighborhood, learning to become network engineers and deploying this network themselves. And there's no more proud moment than to walk down the street and people recognize you as helping your own community. So it's an ecosystem that seems to be working. And I'm happy to share some of the other networks we're building, but that's the particular one that is based on a mesh topology that is also resilient.
Great, thank you. And for those listeners who don't know the terms WAN and LAN, they're wide area network and local area network, just to close that loop. Okay, tell me what other project you're working on that particularly excites you.
Well, one of the ones that we're very excited about is called P.A.W.R. It's funded by the National Science Foundation. It's the platform for advanced wireless research. And the reason why it's so important is it's literally having Harlem and Upper Manhattan become the platform for testing and research that's not being done anywhere in the world. And it will allow this community to leapfrog in technology, at least from a knowledge base, and never trail again. This is unprecedented, never been done in Harlem, and maybe never done anywhere in what we're about to do. And it allows for both telecommunication companies and a startup to test things within our test bed, at the same level. So it's a great way for a small company to test out a new device or a new app or any other software. And it's a great place for the major companies to test out things. So this gives Harlem and Upper Manhattan in general sort of that status of if you want to do something in telecommunications, if you want to do something about connectivity, if you want to do something around applications and services, you got to go to Harlem.
I love that. That's excellent. You will be the go-to guys.
Yeah, and you know what's really great about what we're doing in Harlem? It's attracting so many people into Harlem, and a lot of them are have made up our startup community. And over the last few years, we've been cultivating that community. And when we did our very first meetup in Harlem, we were hoping to get 25 or 30 people. Well, 500 people came out. And what we're realizing is that we're not the only geeks uptown. There's a lot of people uptown that really are focused on technology. And so it was set out, as Silicon Harlem set out, to basically create an innovation, a tech and innovation hub right in Upper Manhattan. And that is something we'll be working on for the rest of our lives, is to make sure that Upper Manhattan, like you see in Silicon Valley, like you see even in Silicon Alley or in Brooklyn, you're going to see a hub where a tech startup will know if they locate in Harlem, they will have the support, the services, and even the capital to thrive, to raise their families, to work and live in Harlem.
You've been listening to an interview with Clayton Banks, co-founder and CEO of Silicon Harlem. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, you'll hear from our time at the Smart Cities New York Conference and Tony Sklar's interview with Professor Daniel Kilper. This is Marcos Dinnerstein, and you've been listening to a Better Mousetrap podcast.
I want to make sure that everyone is invited to Accelerator Awesome, co-production between the Studio Project and Work Awesome, one of the first global gatherings of the Accelerator community worldwide. It'll be happening June 29th this year in New York City. You can find out more at acceleratorawesome.org.
C42D is a branding agency on a mission to make a difference in the world. They work with startups who are solving impossible problems, inventing the future, or improving the planet. Join them on this journey if you're serious about building your business and brand. For more info, go to c42d.com. That's the letter C, the number 42, letter D.com. Did I mention c42d.com? Go there.
Welcome back, listeners, to this episode of a Better Mousetrap podcast. We're continuing our coverage from Smart Cities, New York this past May. Marcos had a great conversation with Clayton Banks, the co-founder and CEO of Silicon Harlem, in the previous interview you just enjoyed before the break. In this interview, I sit down with Professor Daniel Kilper of the University of Arizona and adjunct professor here in New York City at Columbia University. The professor speaks about his role with Silicon Harlem in enabling new services and applications to benefit entire communities through the P.A.W.R project. That's P.A.W.R, a $100 million jointly funded project by the National Science Foundation and the P.A.W.R Industry Consortium, consisting of equipment vendors, device manufacturers, and wireless carriers. These platforms will power research motivated by real-world challenges on experimental next-generation wireless testbeds at scale of cities and communities. The goal is to advance the state-of-the-art for wireless technologies beyond today's 4G, LTE, and emerging 5G capabilities. Tell me a bit about the P.A.W.R project.
Yeah. So P.A.W.R stands for Platforms for Advanced Wireless Research, and this is a program that was set up by the National Science Foundation. And they want to award 4 different cities across the country to set up these platforms. And this year they announced the first 2 cities, and one of those is New York City, here in Manhattan, in fact, in the community of Harlem. And the second one is in Salt Lake City, Utah. And these platforms, so it's advanced wireless research, but for smart city technologies. And it really embraces this notion that smart cities are driving that forward edge, that front edge of technology. And so if you're going to build a platform that's going to enable the new applications, the new capabilities that 5G and beyond would enable, you need that network. You need the infrastructure to make that happen. So these platforms are about bringing in networking and computing infrastructure that you can't find in cities today, so that you can develop the next generation of smart city applications.
What are the beginning challenges that you had to get through in the proposal, and what do you think that the real world challenges will be when you actually start to implement?
So there's a combination of technical challenges as well as sort of deployment and social challenges, and in fact what we've been learning about and really engaging with different partners in the community is understanding how we can work better with the community. And ultimately what we want to do is build not just a research infrastructure type of test bed, but a test bed that can be used by the community, that helps us stimulate economic development, startups, engage that community. And that's part of the concept of putting it in a community is you get the citizens within that community participating, bringing ideas for applications and things that they would like to try out. And the density of people and buildings in New York, it was one of the key aspects that helped us to get the award to be able to set up this test bed here.
Sort of creating a sandbox for a community to be able to develop applications and other types of technology to support their needs. How does that leadership inevitably flow? You're setting up the network of it. That's definitely one part of it, for sure. And what are the other partners that are engaged to help manage it, if you will?
Right. So actually, there's multiple universities involved across from Columbia University, which is housing the main test bed, and up to City College. But actually, the test bed lead is Rutgers University. There's a team out there that developed what's called the Orbit test bed, which was the largest academic wireless test bed in the U.S. and had many years of experience there. And basically, we're taking that test bed, which was in a building, and putting it out onto the streets and in the neighborhoods. And then we also have NYU is involved, and then community organizations and companies like Silicon Harlem, and of course the City of New York, the Mayor's Office, the CTO was deeply involved in sort of all aspects of the planning for this test bed, and they've been great at helping us to get this launched. And there's a portion of it that is for the academics, that we're going to be doing hardcore research there, but it again connects to the community, and so we want people coming in, and not only individuals but businesses. It could be from small companies, startups, all the way to the big players in the 5G wireless are very interested in this, and they can all come in and get time on the test bed. I just sandbox different ideas, try out different technologies. And that's the real idea behind it.
When do you think that it will be up and running? I know that's a tough question. I don't know why I used up and running, but when do you think it'll be up and running?
So the core National Science Foundation funding is for 5 years, and that's to really launch it and get it to a sustainable situation where we have support from industry participants and users who are paying for time on the test bed, and so basically, over the next several years, we're going to be rolling out different phases of the test bed. By the end of this year, we'll have some hardware going out. Initially, the hardware is focused around the universities, Columbia University and City College, where basically we have complete control over the infrastructure and so forth. But we are working with organizations such as Crown Castle, which is providing access to light poles on the streets, and also working with a NYCHA organization to see how we're going to connect with the housing developments there. So it'll really be going out into the community, and we hope that especially that piece that goes out into the community becomes something that the community as well as businesses and other industry partners are building onto. Basically extending to do more and to provide commercial services. University, we can't provide broadband access. We're not a service provider. But many service providers are very interested in the test bed. So here's an opportunity for them to come in and set up services for the residents there and make things happen.
And Professor, finally, you also said you're an adjunct professor in Arizona, is that right?
So actually I'm a professor at the University of Arizona, but I'm adjunct at Columbia University. where I hold a joint appointment there. Yeah.
And out of those two particular cities, do you find that there are differences between how the city thinks in terms of smart cities traction?
I mean, there's a lot of big differences between a place like Tucson, Arizona, and New York City. I mean, the New York City government itself is an enormous organization, and with many folks involved in different branches of the government. Tucson is a much smaller organization, very nimble, and if we want to put something on a light pole, there's a person we can talk to, and and it happens, you know. So, and that was one of the challenges with this, and organizations like the National Science Foundation, they're wondering, can you really make it work in New York, as complex as it is, and each street pole is valuable real estate in a place like New York, and the city came through for us in a huge way, and Columbia University, City College, really making the infrastructure available, making it a way for us to get access to that and make it work in New York.
You've been listening to an interview with Professor Daniel Kilper and an interview by Marcos Dinnerstein with Clayton Banks, co-founder and CEO of Silicon Harlem. Both Clayton and Daniel spoke about these initiatives and more during the 4-day-long Smart Cities New York conference this past May. Marcos and I were in attendance during the Smart Cities New York conference, where we had a chance to speak with many industry leaders, government representatives, and attendees about the entire Smart Cities ecosystem globally. You can find more of these interviews on any of the platforms where you listen to our podcast. I'm Tony Sklar, and you're listening to a Better Mousetrap podcast.
Subscribe to a Better Mousetrap newsletter for tech events, founder opportunities, feature stories by going to bettermousetrap.nyc. That's bettermousetrap.nyc.
You've been listening to a Better Mousetrap podcast, a joint production by Marcos Dinnerstein and Far From TV. For more interviews like this one, follow a Better Mousetrap podcast on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, and don't forget to sign up for the newsletter today.